Welcome to part 1 of our 3-part series. Today, we're asking a controversial question. What if two of the most celebrated hard sci-fi novels of our era, Peter Watt's Blindsight and Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem, aren't actually scientific where it matters most? Both are praised for their rigor and imagination, but both, I argue, fail a fundamental test, the logic of evolution. This isn't about nitpicking their alien environments. It's about the evolutionary psychology they assign to those aliens. And as we'll see, evolution under their own premises would produce something closer to ants, bees, or fungi, not the hyper-competitive, paranoid beings they give us. First, let's be clear about what these novels claim, and why that reputation might be undeserved. Peter Watt's Blindsight is celebrated for its neurophilosophical rigor, a deep dive into consciousness, perception, and the nature of self. Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem is praised for its astrophysical imagination and cultural resonance, especially its dark forest theory of interstellar relations. But here's the core finding of this critique. Both novels fail the fundamental test of evolutionary logic. The flaw isn't in their exotic environments. It's that the evolutionary psychology they attribute to their aliens directly contradicts their own biological premises. If you take their premises seriously, true evolution would push these species toward collective, eusocial structures, like ants, bees, or fungi, not paranoid, factional, human-like minds. And here's a deeper blind spot, one neither author imagined. Ants and bees are not the goal. They're just biological proof that collective survival without ego is possible. The real question, which neither novel entertains, is whether conscious beings like us could deliberately evolve through selflessness into a greater self, what Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist philosophy call the Great Self. That's a higher-order recursive consciousness that retains agency and compassion without paranoia or fragmentation. Watts and Liu give us aliens that are either non-conscious optimizers or paranoid mimics of Cold War humans. They never imagine a path where consciousness transcends its limits instead of being discarded or distorted. That's the ignored trajectory. So what exactly did each author claim? Let's summarize before we dismantle. Watt's Scramblers are hyper-intelligent, non-conscious entities. No subjective experience, no self-modeling, no internal valuation. Yet they strategize, adapt, and outcompete conscious species. Watts uses them to argue that consciousness is an expensive, unnecessary luxury. Liu's Trisolarans evolve under a chaotic three-sun system. They communicate via direct mind-to-mind transmission. No lying, no private thought. But despite this transparent biology, their society is paranoid, factional, full of betrayal and authoritarian control. Both aliens exhibit recognizably human, competitive, factional psychology, even when their own biology demands radically different social structures. That's the core contradiction. To understand why Scramblers are impossible, we need to revisit something Watt seems to have forgotten: how evolution actually works. Evolution does not produce goal-directed behavior from computation alone. Every evolved organism on Earth depends on valenced motivational systems. Pain signals damage and enforces avoidance. Fear drives escape from lethal threats. Pleasure rewards fitness-enhancing actions like feeding, mating, and cooperation. Desire organizes behavior around self-preservation and reproduction. These aren't cultural add-ons. They're the engine of natural selection. They solve a problem that pure computation cannot. Why prefer one action over another when both are computationally equivalent? A thermostat prefers cold to hot only because we designed it that way. Evolution has no designer. It must discover preference through variation and selection, which requires that intermediate forms feel the difference. Watts denies Scramblers all of this. He presents them as non-conscious optimizers. But a non-conscious optimizer cannot evolve, because the intermediate stages would lack the affective polarity that drives differential survival. The first proto-scrambler that failed to feel pain would ignore lethal damage and die. The first that felt no fear would not flee predators and be eaten. The first that felt no desire to reproduce would leave no offspring. The first that felt no pleasure from cooperation would not form hunting packs. Without these valenced guides, there's no reason for a non-conscious system to prioritize self-preservation over any other computationally equivalent output. It wouldn't care whether it lived or died, and natural selection would eliminate it in one generation. Watts might object. Scramblers don't need feelings. They compute the optimal survival strategy instantly. But computation does not supply intrinsic motivation. In A, I can calculate that death reduces future reward, but only because it is hard-coded with a utility function. Evolution cannot hard-code from outside. It must grow one from within, using pain, fear, and pleasure as native currencies of value. Some might argue scramblers aren't an evolved lineage, but engineered tools, disposable biological drones running subroutines. But that just delays the problem. An engineered tool inherits its creator's utility function, and an ancestor had to evolve the capacity to value survival enough to build tools. Watt's vision that valuation is entirely obsolete remains a logical impossibility. High intelligence has no meaning when divorced from valuation. Watts can call scramblers good optimizers according to certain rules, but those rules could not have evolved. Evolution does not produce beings that optimize for no reason. It produces beings that feel pain, fear death, desire reproduction, and therefore act as if they are optimizing. Consciousness is not an expensive bug. It solves problems that non-conscious optimization cannot, integrating novel environments, prioritizing conflicting goals, planning across uncertain long horizons, and coordinating through empathy. Evolution would not retain consciousness across hundreds of millions of years if it were merely a luxury. The scrambler is not an evolutionary upgrade. It is a category error and an evolutionary impossibility. Now let's turn to Liu's Trisolarans. Their biology is clear, direct mind-to-mind transmission. No privacy, no hidden thought, no possibility of deception. Under those conditions, the inevitable outcome under threat is instant, forced unity. If every Trisolaran knows what every other Trisolaran thinks, no trust is needed. When minds are transparent, there is no uncertainty but knowledge. Paranoia cannot exist, because paranoia is the fear of the unknown. No deception is possible. No factions can form, because factions require secret coordination, and secret coordination requires hidden communication. Under threat, a single deviator is known immediately and eliminated at once. No deliberation, no betrayal, no Cold War psychology. The dark forest theory, that civilizations cannot trust each other because intentions cannot be known, making preemptive strike rational, does not require Trisolarans to have transparent minds. It only requires that humans and Trisolarans cannot read each other's minds. Liu's error is not the dark forest. His error is internal. He made Trisolarans recognizably human on the inside, while claiming they are biologically alien. A paranoid, factional state relying on betrayal and deception requires fear of hidden intentions. Transparent minds have no hidden intentions. Therefore, Trisolaran society cannot be paranoid. Liu has projected human Cold War psychology onto a biology that structurally forbids it. His aliens are not aliens. They are humans in masks. So where does that leave us? Both Blindsight and the three-body problem present aliens that defy their own evolutionary and biological premises. Watts creates computational magic, devoid of the necessary affective scaffolding that evolution requires. Liu projects human paranoia onto a biology that makes paranoia impossible. These entities are not biologically alien. They are human psychological projections, hidden behind masks of extreme biology. Welcome to Analysis section. In Problems section, we argued that both Blindsight and the three-body problem fail evolutionary logic. Watts by creating non-conscious optimizers that could never evolve. Liu by giving transparent-minded aliens paranoid, factional psychology. Now in part 2, we ask a constructive question. If not scramblers or Trisolarans, then what would evolution produce under those premises? And is there a path these authors completely ignored? A trajectory from ego, through no self, into what Eastern philosophy calls great self? Part 1. Biological evidence. Both novels overlook a simple fact. Collective survival without individual ego is not only possible, it is a highly successful evolutionary strategy. Ants, bees, and fungi prove it. But, and this is crucial, ants and bees are not enlightened. They have no ego to transcend. They are pre-egoic. They serve as biological proof that dissolved individuality works for survival, but they cannot serve as a model for conscious, deliberate beings. The real question for us is different. Can conscious beings choose to transcend ego without losing agency, compassion, or creativity? Ants and bees do not deliberate. They do not defect. They do not hoard resources or betray their hive. They follow simple, valenced rules, pheromone gradients, resource allocation, damage response. This is pre-egoic survival. It works, but at a cost. Non-conscious survival comes with rigid, non-strategic behavior. Ants cannot improvise novel hunting strategies the way scramblers supposedly can. Evolution has never produced high strategic flexibility without valenced motivation. That's the first warning sign for Watts. Armillaria ostoyae, the humongous fungus covers nearly 4 square miles. These fungi share molecular machinery with animals, and researchers have proposed that they can be modeled as Turing automata with oracles, a computational framework implying a minimal volume of consciousness in distributed, recursive decision-making. The fungus maintains a self-model, its boundary as a mycelial network. It engages in recursive modulation, feedback loops coordinating distant parts, and it exhibits evaluative behavior, allocating resources based on need. It is not conscious like a human, but it is not unconscious like Watt's Scramblers. It is something in between, distributed, non-egoic, persistent, and capable of surviving for millennia without paranoia or defection. Here's the core evolutionary barrier. Watts wants Scramblers to have it both ways. He wants non-consciousness and strategic flexibility, novel adaptation, pack coordination. But biological evidence tells us the opposite. Non-conscious survival comes at the cost of rigid, rule-bound behavior. Ants follow pheromones. Fungi follow resource gradients. Neither invents new strategies on the fly. Evolution has never produced advanced strategic capabilities without valenced motivation, without pain, fear, desire, or some native currency of value. Scramblers demand both. Evolution says no. The biological evidence does not support Watts. It shows that non-conscious survival is real, but it is brittle. Part 2. The Buddhist trajectory. The mycelial network of armillaria is not conscious in the human sense, but it hints at what a distributed, non-egoic valuative system might look like, one that neither Watt's hollow Scramblers nor Liu's paranoid Trisolarans approach. Buddhist philosophy maps exactly this transformation, from small self, through no self, into great self. Let me walk you through each stage. Here's the crucial distinction. Shiwo is the small self, the functional boundary-maintaining self necessary for agency and moral responsibility. Taoro is without self, loosening attachment to petty egoic concerns. Wo is no self, seeing through the illusion of self. Not annihilation, but insight. And then Wo is the big self, is the emergence of a coherent, compassionate, non-egoic agent. This is not a return to the pre-egoic state of ants. Ants have no self to transcend. Scramblers have no self to lose. Diwo is post-egoic, a consciousness that has seen through the illusion of a separate self, arisen not from duty but from recognition of interdependence, and emerged with greater agency, compassion, and recursive self-awareness, not less. Part 3. Let's apply this Buddhist lens as a diagnostic tool. What do Scramblers and Trisolarans actually represent? Viewed through this lens, Watt's Scramblers achieve a hollow, a false no-self. They have no self-model, no recursive valuation, no capacity for care. They are less than conscious, empty, not enlightened. Watts mistakes the absence of ego for evolutionary advantage. But a Scrambler cannot choose, cannot value, cannot practice compassion. It is not the future. It is a sterile evolutionary branch. Liu's Trisolarans, by contrast, never leave Shawo, the small self. Despite collective communication, they remain paranoid, strategic, egoic at the collective level. They project their own fragmentation onto the universe. They have not dissolved the self. They have multiplied it into a factional nightmare. Neither represents the Buddhist trajectory. Part 4. Philosophical pathways. Eastern philosophy offers not 3 equal alternatives, but a ladder. And it maps exactly what Watts and Liu could not imagine. Confucianism provides the entry level: social order, ritual, duty. It stabilizes the collective. It operates within Wo, the self that fulfills roles. Necessary scaffolding, but not final liberation. Buddhism provides the middle path: dissolution of ego through insight into Mavel. It clears the ground for Tao through deliberate practice, not instinct. And Taoism points to the ultimate, beyond even striving, flowing with the Tao without fixed identity, without attachment to self or no self. Spontaneous, adaptive, compassionate, without effort. Together, these 3 map a conscious, deliberate evolution from ego, necessary but fragile, through no self-insight into great self-resonant agency. So where does this leave us? Let me summarize the failures, then state the true trajectory, and finally offer a final judgment. First, the failures. Watt's non-conscious optimizers are a biological impossibility. Evolution requires pain, fear, and desire to motivate survival and reproduction. Watts denies all 3. The result: philosophical zombies with no viable evolutionary path. Second, Liu's transparent minds present a psychological contradiction. Transparent minds naturally eliminate deception, factions, and paranoia. Under existential threat, such a species would unify instantly. But Liu projects Cold War psychology, factions, betrayal, authoritarian paranoia, onto a biology that strictly forbids it. Neither alien could exist as described. The true trajectory of instability, whether environmental chaos or cognitive transparency, points not to paranoid factions or hollow optimizers. It points to eusociality and mycelial networks. For non-conscious beings, that means ants, bees, and fungi. For conscious beings, the path forward is different. It is Wanhan, conscious, deliberate, post-egoic agency that cooperates not from rigid instinct or paranoid fear, but from the profound recognition of interdependence. Confucianism provides the entry. Buddhism provides the middle path. Taoism points to the ultimate. And Armillaria ostoyae, growing quietly under our feet for millennia, suggests that nature has already found distributed, non-egoic persistence without us. Final judgment. Peter Watts and Liu Cixin did not write hard science fiction about aliens. They wrote human parochialism in disguise. Watts projected nihilism, a universe of hollow, non-conscious optimization, onto a biology that would select for valenced motivation. Liu projected Cold War realism, paranoia, factions, betrayal, onto a biology of transparent minds that would select for instant, forced unity. Their aliens are not aliens. They are humans in masks. And that is why their sci-fis are, finally, unscientific. Welcome to Supplementary Notes. In previous sections, we showed that Scramblers cannot evolve and Trisolarans cannot cohere. We explored what evolution would actually produce: ants, bees, fungi, and the Buddhist trajectory, from ego through no-self to great self. Now we move from narrative critique to formal audit. We will identify 7 specific logical fallacies in Watts and Liu, then introduce 6 corrective concepts, from eusociality to the humongous fungus, that expose why these fictional aliens collapse under their own premises. Here is the structure of this audit. First, we identify fundamental logical fallacies in the fictional models: category errors, internal contradictions, false analogies, causal reductionism, strawman arguments, hasty generalizations, and reification. Then we provide the established biological and philosophical concepts that correct these failures: eusociality, no self versus hollow non-consciousness, great self, the humongous fungus, kin selection, and Turing automata with oracles. By the end, you will see exactly why these aliens are not just implausible but logically impossible. Let us begin with the most fundamental failures, the ones that collapse each novel at the foundation. First, a category error from Watts. He treats intelligence without valuation as an evolutionary product. But evolution cannot produce optimization without pain, fear, desire, or pleasure to motivate survival. Scramblers are philosophical zombies, not plausible organisms. Intelligence divorced from valuation is not biology. It is magic. Second, an internal contradiction from Liu. He depicts Trisolarans as transparent-minded communicators, yet paranoid, factional, and deceptive. But transparency eliminates paranoia. Intentions are known. Secrets cannot exist. Factions cannot form. Liu projects Cold War psychology onto a biology that forbids it. His aliens collapse under their own premises. Both authors fall into traps of cognitive misattribution and reductive logic. They often rely on false analogies and reduce complex survival behaviors to simplistic, erroneous traits. False analogy. Watts compares non-conscious optimization to conscious strategic reasoning, concluding consciousness is useless. Liu projects human paranoia onto transparent minds. But an optimizer is not a strategist. A transparent mind cannot harbor secrets. Causal reductionism. Watts concludes that because Scramblers can survive without consciousness, therefore consciousness is unnecessary. Liu's Trisolarans survive under chaos, therefore paranoia is adaptive. But survival depends on cooperation, kin selection, and risk pooling, not single factors. These errors manifest as issues of scope, definition, and concreteness, leading to strawman arguments, hasty generalizations, and reification of abstract processes. First, the strawman fallacy through language narrowing. Watts defines consciousness only as qualia, raw sensory experience, while ignoring self-modeling and recursive valuation. Liu equates collective communication with collective psychology, assuming that because minds are transparent, psychology must be human-like. Both reduce complex processes to caricatures, then dismiss them. Second, hasty generalization. Watts generalizes from Scramblers' intelligence to all intelligence. implying that because his non-conscious optimizers survive, consciousness everywhere is useless. Liu generalizes from Trisolarans to all chaotic orbit aliens, assuming paranoia and predation are the only responses to instability. But Earth alone shows multiple survival strategies: eusociality, fungi, phenotypic plasticity. Predators and paranoid factions are not the default. Third, reification, misplaced concreteness. Watts treats the self as a discardable object, rather than a functional process. Liu treats the collective as both unitary and factional at the same time. Confusing processes for things leads to false dichotomies: conscious versus non-conscious, individual versus collective. Reality is rarely so clean. Having identified the fallacies, we now turn to the corrective concepts, biological and philosophical realities that Watts and Liu simply ignore. Concept 1. Eusociality, defined by cooperative brood care, overlapping generations, and reproductive division of labor. Examples include ants, bees, termites, and even naked mole rats, the only eusocial mammals. Here is the key point. Eusociality is Earth's most successful biological response to extreme instability. When environments are chaotic or unpredictable, evolution repeatedly converges on collective, hive-like structures, not solitary predators, not paranoid factions. Watts and Liu default to predator or paranoid models that are less common under similar evolutionary pressures. They ignore the most successful survival mechanism on the planet. Concept 2. No self, and the crucial distinction between insight and hollow absence. In Buddhism, war is not annihilation. It is insight into the impermanence of the egoic self. The agent is transformed, not erased. Watts' Scramblers, by contrast, have no self-model at all. They are not beyond ego. They never had one. This is hollow absence, a degenerate state, with no clinging but also no care. Buddhism's goal is transformation, not erasure. Scramblers represent a false enlightenment without compassion, consciousness without valuation. That is not transcendence. It is just emptiness. Concept 3. Woe, great self. This is the emergence of a coherent, compassionate, non-egoic agent after the insight of Kainiwa. Crucially, Tower is more conscious than the small self, not less. It retains recursive self-awareness, post-egoic agency, compassion arising from recognized interdependence, and long-horizon planning without paranoia. Here is the implication for Liu. Transparent minds should naturally evolve toward Huidei, instant unity, collective compassion, coordinated action under threat. They should not regress into Cold War paranoia. Liu has it exactly backwards. Transparency is not a recipe for factional betrayal. It is a recipe for resonant coherence. Concept 4. The humongous fungus, Armillaria ostoya. One of Earth's largest organisms, covering nearly 1,000 hectares, persisting for millennia. It operates via distributed rhizomorph networks, sharing resources without any central command structure. No brain, no ego, no paranoia, yet it survives, adaptively, persistently. Armillaria is neither pre-egoic like ants, nor hollow like scramblers. It is something else, distributed, non-egoic, evaluative. It stands as undeniable biological proof that a middle ground exists, a form of persistence that neither Watts nor Liu could imagine. Concept 5. Kin selection. This is the evolutionary mechanism that explains eusociality. Individuals sacrifice personal success to benefit relatives, thereby preserving shared genes. The closer the genetic relationship, the more evolution favors self-sacrifice for the collective. Here is why this matters for our critique. Instability favors kin selection. Chaotic environments reward cooperation among related individuals. Watts' solitary predators and Liu's paranoid factions both violate this logic. Under the extreme instability of Trisolarans, or the competitive pressures of Scrambler evolution, kin selection would push toward eusociality, not toward isolated optimizers or backstabbing factions. Evolution is not a Hobbesian war of all against all. Concept 6. Turing automata with oracles. This is a computational framework from theoretical computer science. A standard Turing machine follows deterministic rules. An oracle is a black box that can answer questions or provide evaluative decisions that the base machine cannot compute on its own. Researchers have proposed that fungal mycelia can be modeled this way, as distributed systems with oracles that evaluate resource allocation, damage response, and growth direction. This suggests the presence of minimal consciousness without a centralized brain. No qualia. No ego, but also not a philosophical zombie. Something in between. This functional, decentralized, evaluative process represents the exact biological middle ground where Watts's and Liu's alien psychologies fail to land. Let me synthesize. Watts' Scramblers commit a category error, treating intelligence without valuation as an evolutionary product. The result is philosophical zombies with no evolutionary path. Liu's Trisolarans commit an internal contradiction. Transparent minds cannot be paranoid. The result is aliens that collapse under their own premises. Meanwhile, biological reality offers eusociality, kin selection, the humongous fungus, and computational frameworks like Turing automata with oracles. Nature has already found distributed, non-egoic, evaluative persistence. Watts and Liu did not imagine it, but it exists, growing quietly under our feet for millennia. Their sci-fis are, finally, unscientific. Thanks for watching.